back to Literally Literary. If this is your first time joining us, be sure to check out our previous episodes. Today, we are continuing our discussion on Borderlands and the Mexican-American story by David Romo. And today, we are joined by the author himself.
Thank you for inviting me.
So great to have you here, David. We've been thinking about and talking about your book a lot recently. We just hosted you here at the Valverde campus of EPCC as part of Spring Arts. With our colleague Rich Yanez.
Mm-hmm. 2 times, and I think I got invited 1 week, and then the next week I came back. The first time for the philosophy department,
That's right.
and then the second time for the English.
Yeah.
So and there were 2 different presentations. The first one really focused on how philosophy, since I studied philosophy in college, how that influenced my book. And then the second one I tried to talk about was kind of as a writer, less the emphasis on the historian, but how to tell stories.
Yeah. Yeah, storytelling so important and present in the book. How important it was to bring up stories that we are not often told in our history classes, but just growing up here, there are a lot of great border stories of resistance and resilience, especially to the high schoolers. I think it's great to, as possible high schoolers reading this, hopefully they are able to see empowerment in those stories.
Yeah, that's what I try to do is, so every chapter has an introduction where I give you like the overview, the chronological, historical overview. Then I try to figure out a vignette, a story with like little details that at first seem unimportant. Like at the cover, on the cover is Severita Lara. So she led a revolt of cheerleaders, the cheerleader revolt that upended like the political system, not only in their small town of Crystal City, but later it had an impact across the United States with La Raza Unida party.
Yeah.
So that detail that some cheerleaders were protesting the fact that there could only be one Mexican-American cheerleader and the 3 had to be Anglos, even though the Mexican-Americans were the majority of the school.
Right.
It seems like such a small detail, almost an unimportant one. But look at the transformation that happened from that.
Definitely. And it follows that pattern, right, of like discrimination as well. But actually that kind of leads up nicely to Vanessa's question. Well, one of them, right?
What's the question?
I know, I was like, I don't know how that led up to that.
I saw that thread too, honestly.
Did you?
Yeah.
Which question? Okay.
Which one?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, this is one of the first, I guess, fully nonfiction books that we've done. Like, we've done memoirs and other things, but this is a different type of nonfiction that we've done. And so I guess I was just curious about like your research process and like how you went about finding all of the information.
So the final research for this book was maybe close to a year, but in order to do a year's worth of research, I had already done lots and lots of research before that. So for instance, when I looked at the Pachucos and the global connections, I talk about how the Schwing kids and the Schwingjugend in Germany were influenced by the Zoot Suit, both of the Pachucos and the African Americans, and the Zazu in Paris. That research I had done for my dissertation because I was looking at connections. I actually went to Germany for 3 years, and that's where I found that. So there's a lot that I had already done way before I was asked to write this book by Penguin Press. So a lot of times most of my research was a result of about 4 years at the basement of the downtown library. Well, now I don't know if they have a basement now the same way, but that's where the archives were, right?
Yeah.
And I would just like scroll through the newspapers, through old newspapers, just to see something that caught my imagination. And I would usually say something like, "Holy crap." And if I said, "Holy crap," that was what ended up in my book.
Yeah.
And was that publicly available, or did you have to request access?
No, I mean, I'm talking about like even back when I was writing Ringside Seat to Revolution, it's publicly available. You just go down to the microfilm. They have these reels with old newspapers.
Yeah.
So I just started like in 1881, and then I got hooked, and I was just like read the whole newspaper, like for cool stories that nobody had ever written about. And that's really how, like the story of Carmelita Torres that now has so much resonance. I mean, it's, they just did an interview with me for a couple of German newspapers. So it's like global, right? And that was a result of that, of just reading old newspapers and say, holy shit. Like, wow, I got to look into this, right?
Yeah.
And then that leads you to another thing, that leads you to another. So that led me to the National Archives in Washington, D.C. And then I found, these documents that were showing the use of Cyclone B as a pesticide here by German. So I went to Bethesda National Library of Medicine. So it's just kind of, I follow the clues. It's almost you're following the spirit. Whatever captures your imagination, you dig deep, and then you try to figure out where to dig deeper. So that's always been my process. Really, just follow the spirit. Don't have preconceived notions, because a lot of times in academia you have to have a thesis sentence, and then you cherry pick the information so that it supports what you already figured out was what you wanted to say. In my case, I didn't know what I was going to say. A lot of this was just discovery.
No, I love that.
Yeah.
Speaking of your research, you just mentioned there was an award.
This book has gotten like 4, maybe 5 important national awards. Kirkus Review gave it the best book of, what was it, 2024? Now I read.
It's a big name in publishing.
It is. People pay $400 to get their book reviewed. Sometimes, and I didn't have to pay because they automatically review big name presses.
Yes.
So, but other people will pay $400 and then they give them a crappy review. Imagine,
my heart. That would break my heart.
Exactly. Even after you paid, right? So that when they like it, it's real, right? It's not. They're not just kind of BSing you.
And you had just talked about that there's a museum in New Mexico that features some of the work too. You were interviewed by some students.
Yeah, I was interviewed by some students that used my research, especially on all this, on braceros and the use of DDT and Cyclone B, for a national competition of history. They were high school students. They call me. Sometimes I get calls from I just got a message from where they were like, I forget if it was Singapore or Seoul, Korea, like people will ask me, hey, can I interview you? And I usually say yes. So I said yes to them, these 2 students, and I think they just got like the national award for their presentation.
Yeah.
It's kind of like a history fair, kind of a science fair, but at the national level.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah, no, I'm very grateful to know that that the book has impact on students, high school students, because it's aimed at young adults. So I would say 13, 14 and up. But I've had people that are 70 years old that I say, God, I wish I had this book when I was growing up.
Yeah.
And you do like a great job of telling me all kinds of stories that I've never heard before. And that's what I tried. I really tried to give you stories that I'm pretty sure most people hadn't heard with the kind of detail that I give them.
I think that kind of leads into my next
does.
question, actually. So the tone, like you said, it's geared more towards young adults. How was it navigating writing to like a younger audience?
Yeah, no, the great question. So for me, it liberated me because when you write for academia, sometimes you're writing for your superiors, quote unquote, right? For your mentors, and you gotta show how smart you are. You gotta use all the technical jargon, and you have to, come up with a very complicated theoretical analysis. And this, I was trying to make it as accessible as possible, and I tried not to use more than like 8 words per sentence. And if I would come up with even a complex term like racial capitalism, I would try to explain it with vignettes. And so it was liberating for me not to write like an academic. Not that my first book was an academic book either, because I wrote that even before I had a PhD, which is funny. I took a couple of graduate school levels later. I decided I'm going to get my PhD, and my book was required reading in the class that I was taking.
Oh, that's so crazy.
Kind of more of a zoomed out question. We talked a lot about this book in terms of like all the activism and like in its intended audience, you can kind of see that already with some of the feedback that you're getting, right? It's inspiring this new generation. And so I wanted to ask about your role here as a Borderlander. Like, you're a historian and you're uncovering, all these buried and suppressed stories, I should say, and bringing in the counter narratives that fight against, this grand and false view of the American story. But you're also, very involved in the streets, in activism, like in Duranguito, and very involved with the Chucanex as well. We mentioned that with Ruby Montana at UTEP. So my question is, like, how do you see that in terms of what we as academics or non-academics should be, doing, to both kind of like preach the good word, so to speak, right? But also like this scholar activist identity, basically.
I've never believed anybody has ever written an objective book. For a long time, academic historians would say, well, I'm objective. I'm looking at all sides of the question. And I would say, BS. Just the fact that you're writing in English. That's the language of a colonizer, right? Yeah. And you just think you're objective, but within your narrow parameters of thought. And what I wanted to do is kind of take that mask off and saying, look how American history has always been taught, for instance, from east to west. So the Pilgrims land at Plymouth Rock, and then you don't see the Indians until much later in the Wild West and the taming of the Wild West, right? But even if you change the geographical perspective and you look at it from south to north, then all of a sudden it's not Plymouth Rock. It's here, El Paso, where people land to colonize as Europeans. Right. 2 decades before Plymouth Rock. But in reality, people had been migrating back and forth here in a way that they weren't migrating at Ellis Island or Plymouth Rock, because that started with, quote unquote, the American nation. Right. And so I wanted to just contest all that stuff. That you're saying you're objective? No, you're not objective. You're just like too stupid to know that you are subjective. Yeah. Right? And so that's what I wanted to show with this book, to a counter master narrative. Yeah,
exactly. I was just saying that it's like a grand narrative that we're taught and never really think about a question. But I love that you start with the footprints. Yeah, of the children playing, and that's such a beautiful human touch. Them.
Yeah, because even when what little we know of archaeology, which we don't much, it's always just, I don't know, about ceramics and bones. It's almost like people are collecting stuff and putting it in museums. And to me, that's white archaeology. There's this appropriation, this need to collect the stuff of indigenous brown people so that it could raise their prestige in museum collections and all that. And to me, it was about the human beings, right? And so if I want to give little kids a voice, I say, look, your first footprints, they were kids that made these footprints because they have so much energy and they like to jump and slip in the mud and all that, right? So, yeah, I very deliberately, I'm glad you caught that was the metaphor for the whole book. Like I'm saying, the footprints are everywhere.
And I love that you come back to it at the end too with the tornillo, the kids and their artwork and
yes,
and even the chinchilagua at the end. I mean, it's not like I have to give you a spoiler alert, right? At the end, there's a Victor Casas, the mural with little kids are mask and it's a mural about little kids playing, right? and I could see them kind of still leaving their footsteps. This time maybe on the dirt or the cement, but they have this deep meaning that you don't know. 20,000 years from now, somebody might find those footprints too.
It's almost historical and like patterns. I'm sure in your research you saw a lot of patterns as well. That's how you kind of recognize stuff. But I think a huge part is also your music. Even in putting this book together, you almost mentioned like chorus repetition motifs, that keep coming up.
Yeah,
I don't know if that came.
So Bowie High School was one of those repetitive riffs, right? I wanted to take you to Bowie High School from the very beginning when the Ku Klux Klan established it and called it by the name of a hero of the Alamo that it shouldn't have been calling it that. And then I wanted to take you kind of down the years, the 30s, when these kids, I remember first reading about that 1937 dignity strike where the kids said, we're not hungry. Like, stop humiliating us. We're going to rise up for our dignity. Well, there was more to that strike than meets the eye. And I'll come back to that. Yeah. But then I went into another period, like they were influential in the whole Pachuco movement, right? And so many kids, young men and women from Bowie ended up going to all different places during World War II, right? They sent more soldiers of Mexican-American descent than any other high school in the United States. And then, of course, the whole lawsuit against the INS, which really had a huge impact even today, right? So you keep coming back to that theme. It's kind of like when I play the sax, so sometimes you just play that theme again with a different...
slight variation.
Yeah, slight variation and different harmonics. Going back to the Bowie High School, the 1937, it's, again, those details that you see when you think that, oh, why is this important? Like cheerleaders, like, so what if they just have one cheerleader or three cheerleaders? And this too, like, why is that important? That these kids, all right, they're a little too proud, right? They're protesting because they felt embarrassed that they were placed on the front page of the local newspapers and that they were hungry and that we needed to help them out. And it was ultimately a call for white charity, right? And so if you look at it and you can almost demean them, come on. And the other adults did demean them. They say, you bunch of ungrateful hoodlums, right? But remember during the 1930s, the whole rhetoric was that Mexicans and brown people were burdens. They were social welfare burdens. And so that was just replicating that narrative, right? You put these poor little Mexican kids from Bowie as recipients of welfare, but you kind of humiliate them in the process. There's a power dynamic. But it goes beyond that abstract level. So Dr. Leyva, historian from UTEP, she did a whole study on how some of the local benevolent societies, the local private welfare societies, whenever they gave food to certain Mexican families, they would stamp their passports. So during the Great Repatriation, when the U.S. government illegally deported, some scholars think 2 million people, others less, 60% of them were Mexican Americans, like these kids from Bowie. And if you go to Mexico in the 30s with a passport stamp that you received charity, then you can't go back to the U.S. That was a way to deport you indirectly. So you see, you have to know that whole structure to know that what that story is about. You need to know the context. Otherwise, it's a cool story, and I want people to read it at whatever level they're at. So I used to teach chess at Bowie and in the Segundo Barrio, and I would say chess it's an old Indian saying from India. Chess is like an ocean that a mosquito can drink from and an elephant can drown in. So that's kind of what I'm trying to do with this book. You can just read the vignette. It's a cool little story about, I don't know, cheerleaders. But it's so much deeper than that.
I do like the reflection questions at the end of each section, just because, especially again, considering the audience, an opportunity to just think about some of the main kind of lessons and takeaways in each section. Were you part of that? Because I know this is part of the Race to the Truth. So, like, how did you work with them a lot on?
Oh yeah, no, yeah. They would ask me at every chapter, put 3 or 4 questions, and I try to kind of go to the core and have them reflect. Like one of the questions is, what would you have done if the land where you were living was invaded? Like how the Americans invaded these lands that used to be Mexican lands and indigenous lands. What would you have done? Or how would it have felt for you to go through the baths and the fumigations? So I wanted them to not only think about it intellectually, I wanted them to feel this history.
Yeah. And, so much of this book is about passing it on to the next generation, right? And so one of my questions that actually, our previous co-host, Reina, is the one who always asks is, so I'll ask it on her behalf, is who were your own, mentors or figures you looked up to, like either in print or in person that, really shaped you into the activist and scholar that you are today?
So the family stories that I was told by my great aunt, who first told me about the fumigations at the Santa Fe Bridge. Her stories were cinematic. When she was 12, she took a rose to a federal and gave it to her. He was like, had this, according to her, like he was dressed almost like a charro. And in response, this federal kidnapped her. And she tells me like these terribly hard stories, right, while I'm growing up. And then, but at the same time, they were so human and so compelling. And I remember thinking, why haven't I ever read any of this? And like when she told me the whole thing about how demeaning it was to go through these baths, and she told me a detail about her shoes, that she put them in a big secadora and that they had melted. That detail totally captured me. And then later, when I was doing research, I found a picture of shoes in a big secadora and a big steam dryer.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
So it was that personal connection. And then in terms of like intellectual, I remember Katz, Friedrich Katz, he wrote like this big Bible of Pancho Villa. And it was, 1,000 pages long. And I could recognize so many of the places because a lot happened here in El Paso. And I'm thinking, wow, 1,000 pages of Pancho Villa. So when I started doing research for Ringside City to a Revolution, I was like trying to find every like single toilet that Pancho Villa had sat on here in El Paso, right? Yeah. I was just like, okay, I'm going to go investigate. So that's the first one that comes to my mind. But of course, there's a lot of, I've studied all kinds of stuff. So, yeah.
You speak a lot on like the tools of colonizers, dividing, even like the role of like unbridled consumerism and capitalism. But like there's a focus on like, erasing people's culture and language, like epistemic violence, we call it. But,
Absolutely.
Tell us too, you have active efforts. We talked about the Chucanex Club and your walking tours, Los Liminals.
Yeah.
Even now you're doing Nahuatl classes. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So a lot of people thought that the reason I was fighting for Duranguito is because I'm a historian. He cares about old buildings. No, these old buildings that the city of El Paso wanted to tear down to build an arena weren't just old buildings. You first had to kick out the people, and the people themselves had living histories. So Romelia was one of the last women to standing, through this. And she would literally tell us ghost stories, then whatever these ghost stories are that she knew personally. So whether you believe in ghosts or not, these stories had like spiritual significance to her, right? And so every single building will tell you a different chapter. The Chinese laundry that talks about the importance of the largest Chinatown in Texas, and the fact that the Camino Real passed through Duranguito. That was one of 3 branches. The fact that there was an Apache peace camp underneath Duranguito that you're going to find the bones of the Ende people, and you're going to find their remains, because 1,000 mezcaleros lived in Duranguito in the late 1700s. All of that helped us, little by little, turn the tide, this historical knowledge, against what the effort was. If you tell people that they have no history, that they have no roots, then it's easier to displace them, not only because you kick them out of their homes, but to later deport them and just say, you don't belong here, right? So the first thing that the Missouri volunteers came, Donovan, when they took over El Paso del Norte, which is Mexicano lands, was that they went down to the mission, and they took the records, especially the land deeds, and used them. They burned them up for candles. And so what do? You first rob people's lands, and then you rob their memory, so that you will forget that these were once your lands. Mm-hmm. And then you play with records so that you're no longer, they don't allow you to call yourself indigenous. So to call yourself indigenous, they police your identity, and you got to do this and these requirements to get it federally recognized. And I say, no, we are indigenous. Just because we've been detribalized, we are still indigenous. Yeah. And I personally, as a historian, I can trace the names of my indigenous grandmothers and grandfathers, right? Most people can't, because that's part of what they don't teach you in school on purpose. This whole book is the history they don't teach you on purpose. Because if they zap your memory, they can steal everything, not only your lands, but your soul. So yeah, learning Nahuatl is a way of transforming ourselves. Sometimes you just pronounce a word like Tlazo Kamati, that means thank you, but it comes from the word Tlazotla, which means to love, and Mati, which means to know. So when you thank somebody, you're acknowledging that they know how to love, right? And already that one word, Tlazo Kamati, will give you a whole new way of thinking. To ask, what is your name, is Ken Timotoka, which means how were you planted? Like, how are your roots, you know? Yeah. So
we were just talking about translation today, and it's like how that's a beautiful gesture, right? And it embedded in that. Wow, there's the word right there.
There you go. Is that what I dedicated to you? Yeah. There you go.
Yeah, I was trying to, what was it in mind?
Let's see. Aokik tipololoske. We will not be erased.
There you go.
There you go. So you had to look that up, huh? But I don't think AI is that advanced yet.
Yeah, I wouldn't trust AI for that.
No, I don't trust it either.
I'm always interested to see where a writer's words take them. Where has this taken you so far? And if you have an idea of where it will be taking you in the near future.
So I think the first part of the book, I really wanted to tell, especially young people, you think you've been cut off from your indigenous background. But look, when you use the word aguacate, tomate, coyote, tamal, you're speaking an indigenous language. You just don't know it, right? When your great-grandma or your grandmother rubs herbal medicine on you, that's part of your indigenous culture. Mm-hmm. Yeah, when you say the words, when you eat the food, like you have no idea. Even, of course, you eat aguacates or vanilla or chocolate. All that is part of the indigeneity that you have forgotten you had. So I think that first part of my book has really, really influenced me to decolonize myself through going back to these roots, and because I get tired sometimes of naming the poisons that have been used against us. The poisons, of course, include DDT. 4 million braceros were sprayed with DDT that can cause cancer, and Cyclone B that can kill you, gasoline, kerosene, cryolite, right? There were cases where the American white settlers would come with strychnine, which is rat poison, and put it on loaves of bread so that indigenous people would eat it and die. So that's heavy stuff, like really, really heavy stuff. So I don't only want to know about the poisons and name the poisons. I want to figure out the antidotes. And I think that's what historians need to do. Like, we know the trauma, and it's good to know the trauma because you have to diagnose it. What is the name of the poison they've used on us? Trump says immigrants will poison the blood of the nation. That every accusation is a confession. White people have poisoned us, literally, in a way that immigrants and brown people have never poisoned them.
Yeah.
They're accusing us of something they've been doing for hundreds of years. So what is the antidote? And I think the antidote, the pachtli, which is the Nahuatl word for medicine, is in the roots, right? That's the roots is what is going to heal us.
It's a great image too, figuratively.
Your questioned out?
We
I usually only come with 2.
I hope this doesn't deviate too much, but we just saw our friend Eddie Groove Acosta at Jefferson High School. He wanted to ask, when's the CD coming out?
When is the CD coming out? You know what happens?
And to provide a little bit of context, we're talking about Los Liminals, but a lot of it involves storytelling and reclaiming language.
Yeah. It's funny because you've been through different manifestations of what is now Los Liminals.
Yeah, true.
Back when it was glossolalia, which means speaking in tongues. And it was like there was a jam that we had for Donna Snyder when we played at, I forget.
Old Sheepdog.
Was it Old Sheepdog? No, it was even before that.
The Little Temple at Rio Grande, probably.
Even before that, there was like a bar there and like
so many places.
So many, right?
That's great.
And it was Carlos Fidel Espinosa, and you and me kind of jamming, right? You were playing the drums, and that's where I told Carlos, "Hey, let's start a group." And then,
that's right.
then later we invited Adri Lopez.
She's so great. She's great. She's a powerhouse storyteller, poet.
Oh, incredible. And it's just kind of organically took its own. And so we have recorded, but then we outgrow our recordings before we even have a chance to
noticed that.
We've taken whole different directions and we say, oh man, that stuff we did is already old.
The Lechugas in there.
Exactly. Now we have recordings with Fernando Lechuga, Ernie Tinajero. And then lately we have these, and everybody's invited every Tuesday at 6 p.m. at the Raíces Cafe, Film Cafe, Nueva Raíces at 105 Texas. We have Nahuatl classes, Aztec philosophy, and native drumming. So we have a huehuet and the different, flutes and conchas, and that's kind of the direction we're taking now.
Okay.
So. Tell Eddie that our old.
He's listening right now.
Hey Eddie, Eddie, sorry about that, man. Our old stuff is already too old. I mean, we'll figure out where we're going with it.
It's very appropriate of liminal space. We're always changing.
Exactly. We've totally changed, and maybe that's it. Like when you record it, you freeze it in time, and it's just too hard for us to freeze ourselves in time.
Snaps.
And I'm reminded of what you've been saying about I'm reminded of the people's history, right, of the United States from Howard Zinn, and this idea of what you said about there's no objectivity, right? You're always taking a side. It's about you can't be neutral on a moving train.
Yeah. He came up with some great stuff, man. One of my favorites, and I quoted him once, was like they have the tanks, they have the weapons, but we have the poets, and therefore we will win.
Yeah.
Love that.
Yeah.
I look forward to more work, keeping this whole thing going, the momentum, speaking of. Man, thanks for talking with us today.
No, I'm really honored you guys are really doing a great service to writers and, in my case, historians, because you take the time to really read. I've been in some interviews where I could tell that the host hadn't read the book,
Wow.
And they're asking me questions from like 10 years ago or something, right? And I'm like, oh, man.
Yeah.
Whereas I really appreciate how much thoughtfulness you guys have for this.
Yeah, that means a lot coming from you. So thank you.
Thank you. Tlazokamati.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of Literally Literary, recorded at Power at the Pass and brought to you by Border Senses. This episode, we continued our discussion on Borderlands and the Mexican-American story by David Romo. If you haven't read it, we hope we inspire you to pick up a copy. Join us on our next episode and follow us on Instagram at literallyliterary.ep.